The Blair Witch Project is a 1999 American found footage horror film. It was written and directed by Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez, and it was actually a very popular film for its time back in 1999. Found footage films are when a character finds a camera and then what you're seeing in the entire movie is the footage found on that camera. So in the case of the Blair Witch Project, it's a fictional story, fictional acting, and fictional effects like a camera work and all that. But it's presented as a real story, like someone actually found this camera somewhere and then is replaying that for the audience. The Blair Witch Project is actually about three fictional filmmakers, Heather Donahue, Michael C. Williams, and Joshua Leonard, who are actually named after their real-life actors and actresses. They basically disappear near the woods in Maryland in a town called Burkittsville, small town, and basically they're filming a legend about a witch. In the Blair Witch Project movie, we are told that they were never heard from again, and that this found footage or recovered footage is the film that the viewers are watching. This film, The Blair Witch Project, was so successful it grossed over $248 million worldwide. Blair Witch Project is a great movie, but did you know it has its own lore and backstory to the movie's fictional storyline? Yes, there's a backstory to the Blair Witch Project, and it's not as simple as you might expect. At first it seems like, okay, there's the Blair Witch Project, and maybe it's real, maybe it's not. It blurs the lines between fiction and reality in terms of a film, and that really is emphasized with the found footage. Just 1 year after the Blair Witch Project's release, a sequel was already made, and that is called Book of Shadows Blair Witch 2. The Blair Witch 2 Book of Shadows is interesting enough because it takes your traditional campy teen horror film and it makes that all based around the first movie, which is a found footage movie once again. So it's about these fictional characters and it's presented in a movie, traditional style horror movie, but with the characters being influenced by the Blair Witch Project original film, and all the story around that film as affecting the new characters in the Blair Witch 2 Book of Shadows. It remains a part of the lore of the Blair Witch Project series. To begin looking at the chronology and the timeline of the Blair Witch series, you first have to notice that the Blair Witch Project is where it began, but that's not where the story begins either. There's also the Blair Witch 2, which is of course a follow-up to the Blair Witch. So those go in that order, just 1 and 2. If you're just looking at the films, that's all there really is to it. But if you look at the overall lore and backstory of the Blair Witch Project, there's a whole lot more and it's going to get a lot weirder, guys, so hang on. In the year 2000, around the release of Blair Witch 2 Book of Shadows, the Blair Witch Project received its own trilogy of video games known as the Blair Witch series. This series of PC-exclusive video games included 3 volumes. Volume 1, Rustin Parr, Volume 2, The Legend of Coffin Rock, Volume 3, The Ellie Kedward Tale. All 3 of these games included backstory of the Blair Witch Project. Now, without getting into the actual storylines too much of each individual game or movie, we're just going to look at the overall timeline and chronology of the Blair Witch series as a whole. Because there's a lot to it. There's a lot more than you might think besides these first 2 movies. The first game, Rustin Parr, takes place in the 1940s, where a government agency known as Spook House, very similar to the X-Files, takes an investigation up in the town of Burkittsville, investigating some paranormal occurrences. So this game plays like a third-person Resident Evil style horror game set in the Blair Witch universe. Now that game actually received a sequel called The Blair Witch Volume 2, The Legend of Coffin Rock, which is actually not really a sequel, even though it's number 2. It's actually a prequel, so this comes before that. The second game in the series, Blair Witch Volume 2, The Legend of Coffin Rock, takes place during the American Civil War. You play as a Union soldier who was wounded in battle, left for dead, and wakes up in the woods from the Blair Witch Project. Now the third game in the series, Blair Witch Volume 3, The Ellie Kedward Tale, takes place even further back in the timeline to the very origins of what the Blair Witch legend is. So you take place in the Blair Township, which was later renamed Burkittsville, the town from the Blair Witch Project. In the third game, you learn what the witchcraft actually is and how this legend began. Now, it seems pretty straightforward still. You've got the Blair Witch Project, the Blair Witch Project 2, and the Blair Witch trilogy of video games. It does go a step further because the Blair Witch Volume 1 Rustin Parr is actually a prequel to the Blair Witch Project, as well as a sequel to another video game called Nocturn. Nocturn was a survival horror PC video game that took place in the late 1920s and the early 1930s. Now, once again in the game Nocturn, you have that X-Files style government agency called Spook House, which investigates paranormal activity, monsters, demons, werewolves, vampires, and so on. And this is where the connections start to make sense and at the same time get a little weird. In the game Nocturn, it's not just Spook House that's a similarity to the Blair Witch Volume 1 Rustin Parr. You also have things like Demites. Demites are demon monsters, and it's just like their own term for it. Sort of like the Deadites and Evil Dead. They're basically Demites, and they're from the game Nocturn. But they're also in the beginning of the Blair Witch Project Rustin Parr video game. Now, another thing that's a similarity is both games have a character. She's a vampire, and her name is Svetlana. Now, Svetlana is important, so we're going to keep an eye on Svetlana. The Blair Witch Project Volume 1 Rustin Parr carries over some main characters from the game Nocturn directly. And also, you play as a minor character from Nocturn, but she is the main character that you play as in the Blair Witch Project Volume 1. The game Nocturn was supposed to have a sequel game. This game was cancelled and never released. However, developers Terminal Reality created another game which spawned its own series, but it is also set in the same universe as Nocturn, which in turn means that it's set in the same universe as the Blair Witch Project games, all three of them, as well as the movie Blair Witch Project and Blair Witch Project 2 Book of Shadows. The game that I'm talking about is BloodRain. Yes, BloodRain, the game where you play as a female vampire protagonist who's actually a dhampir, which is the child of a human and a vampire. She's sort of an action hero vampire, and she fights Nazis, and it's a little action-oriented, not so much of a horror game, but it sort of reminds you of like Legacy of Kain a little bit. In the video game BloodRain, the main character is named Rain, and she is directly based off of the character from Nocturn and the Blair Witch Project Volume 1 Rustin Parr named Svetlana, who is also a vampire. Rain and Svetlana share some similarities, but they're not exactly the same, but it is directly based on that. There is some other similarities between the Blair Witch Project, Nocturn, and BloodRain. For one, there is Demites. Demites appear in all three series and have the same name and sometimes the same designs. The first BloodRain game's working title was Nocturn 2, and while it's not exactly a sequel to Nocturn, it does carry over some similarities aside from Svetlana turning into Rain. One of them is the German castle from Nocturn is in BloodRain. BloodRain actually had a sequel called BloodRain 2, and then later on it had a downloadable only side-scrolling game called BloodRain Betrayal. BloodRain has since fizzled out as a series, and actually had two other canceled games in the BloodRain series. One was for the PSP, and one was later on for the Nintendo 3DS. In addition to the three BloodRain games, there's actually three BloodRain films, which brings us back into the realm of movies. So we go from movies with the Blair Witch Project, to games with the Blair Witch Project games, all the way to more games with Nocturn, and then to other games with BloodRain. And then we go back into the realm of movies with the BloodRain films, which are a spin-off, sort of a retelling of the video game BloodRain. So the first one is BloodRain, and it came out in 2006, so that's after the Blair Witch Project movies were released. And then you've got BloodRain 2 Deliverance in 2007. A few years later, we had BloodRain The Third Reich in 2010. So now that we know the information and details behind the shared timeline of the Blair Witch Project, Nocturn, and BloodRain series, and that they're all kind of one series mixed in together in their own fictional universe, what does this mean to your average movie viewer who just wants to watch the Blair Witch Project and have a good experience with it? Are they really missing anything? In my honest opinion, no. If you just want to share the Blair Witch Project as a film with your friends and family, or if you're someone new picking up for the first time, there's nothing you're really missing here. It's pretty much just the movie, and that's pretty much all you need. The information to enjoy this film is all in one sitting and one viewing of this film. Now, it is interesting to me, if you're a fan of something, to look at the expanded history, the extended universe, the lore, the backstories of these games and movies. And not just the Blair Witch and this surrounding lore about this game and movie, also things like the Lord of the Rings, how it has multiple volumes outside of just Lord of the Rings. And then there's like a film adaptations of Lord of the Rings, there's multiple of those. Things like Star Wars has a great extended universe and a huge lore of canon and non-canon entries in Star Wars. Things like Marvel Comics with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as well as other things like X-Men and Deadpool. So you've got lots of different franchises that have sort of an expanded series. Everything's connected. And with the Blair Witch Project, it's kind of funny because you wouldn't expect it at first, and that's why I'm bringing it up. So you got the Blair Witch Project and Blair Witch 2. You might just be better off watching the first one. The second one I don't highly recommend, but it is interesting to watch, and it is a film. Now, once it comes to the video games, it's basically for people that want more of a backstory. This is mainly for gamers. And it's actually quite a hardcore game. It's a little bit scary. It's a horror game. It actually has some jump scares and stuff like that. So, the Blair Witch series, it's a good side story to the Blair Witch Project film. And its sequel as well. Now, if you really want to get into it, I'd recommend going to Nocturn, but not going too much further after that. Unless you're really into vampires, then you might want to check out BloodRain. However, the connections are so slim that it's almost not worth mentioning. The only reason I even made this video to begin with is just because it's such a bizarre story, connecting the Blair Witch Project to BloodRain, and then Nocturn's kind of there in the middle. It's just really interesting that these are actually connected, and that's basically the only reason that I'm bringing this up. And just for your information, these games actually came included as a trilogy set, which also included Blair Witch 1 and 2 in a box set. So these all came together for me. Of course, it didn't come with Nocturne or BloodRain, but I made those connections later. To conclude this video, the Blair Witch series of video games on PC are pretty much what sparked my interest in finding out about this timeline. I'll have all my sources in the credits of this video, and it's pretty simple stuff. I mean, most of it's just from playing the game and finding these connections myself, but there is some outside sources. Alright everybody, that's about it for this little video on the timeline, the shared timeline of the Blair Witch series. Now, if you'd like to see a little bit more information on this game, including gameplay, check out my channel, Happy Weird Games. I'll have a link to that video specifically in the description below. In an upcoming video on Happy Weird Games, we'll be checking out the first game, Volume 1 Rustin Parr of the Blair Witch series on PC, as a gameplay video. It's not a Let's Play, it's not a direct gameplay either, in terms of a complete game, but it is a gameplay video. If you're familiar with my channel, Happy Weird Games, you'll know what to expect, except it'll be about the game, the Blair Witch Project, Rustin Parr, and in the future, we will continue on with The Legend of Coffin Rock and the Ellie Kedward tale. Alright everybody, thanks for watching Happy Weird Games, your source for classic gaming goodness. For more classic gaming goodness, subscribe to Happy Weird Games today. And as always, until next time, Happy Weird Games will see you then. Happy Weird Games? Oh!